Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, Wado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 11, part C. I'm giving some more because I have the time to do it. And I missed like 3 days or something. I don't know. Anyway, I've read in Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And the book looks like this. If you want to go ahead and buy a copy, I highly suggest you do. Anyway, excuse me. Many other slave owners, of course, saw their slaves as simply a source of wealth and were therefore determined to hold on to them for that reason. However, even those slaveholders with aversions to slavery in principle were constrained by a strong tradition of stewardship, in which the family inheritance was not theirs to dispose of in their own lifetime, but to pass on to others, as it had been passed on to them. George Washington was one of those who had inherited slaves, and dying childless, freed his slaves in his will, effective on the death of his wife. His will also provided that slaves too old or too beset, B-E-S-E-T, with quote unquote bodily infirmities to take care of themselves should be taken care of by his estate, and that the children were to be quote unquote taught to read and write and trained for quote unquote some useful occupation. His estate, in fact, continued to pay for the support of some freed slaves for decades after his death in accordance with his will. I don't know about you, but I've never heard of that, okay? Like from George Washington, I've literally heard that he did them dirty, that he even fathered children with his slaves and didn't want to claim them and stuff. Never did I ever hear that he wanted them taken care of. And when everything ended, he wanted them to continue to be taken care of, as well as be taught like the trades, a trade, something, read, write, and be able to care for themselves and give them an occupation that they can stand on their own 2 feet with and stuff. Oh my God. The part of Washington's will dealing with slaves filled almost 3 pages, and the tone as well as the length of it showed his concerns. The Emancipation Clause stands out from the rest of Washington's will in the unique forcefulness of its language. Elsewhere in it, Washington used the standard legal expressions, quote unquote, I give and bequeath, and then quote unquote, it is my will and direction. So you understand that he wasn't looking down on these folks. He was treating them as if you were leaving something to family members, right? Someone that you care about. It's not like, take care of the dog and this is how you take care of the dog and whatever it is. He used formal language, okay? In one instance, he politely wrote, quote unquote, end quotes, by way of advice, I could recommend to my executors, end quote. But the Emancipation Clause rings with the voice of command. It has the iron firmness of a field order, end quotes. I do hereby expressly forbid the sale of any slave I may die possessed of under any pretext whatsoever, end quote. Long before reaching this point in his personal life, George Washington had said of slavery as a national issue, end quotes, there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it, end quote. But like Burke, he saw a need for a plan of some sort rather than simply freeing millions of slaves in a newly emerging nation surrounded by threatening powers, just as the freed slaves themselves would be surrounded by a hostile population. In short, the moral principle was easy, but figuring out how to apply it in practice was not. Moreover, in a country with an elected government, how the white population at large felt could not be ignored. When Washington congratulated Lafayette for the latter's purchase of a plantation where former slaves could live, he added, end quotes, would to God a like spirit. Oh God, how they spoke and wrote back then, I mean, come on, right? So I'm like trying to say it as it's written. Would to God a like spirit would diffuse itself generally into the minds of the people of this country, but I despair of seeing it, end quote. He saw legislation as the only way to end slavery and said that a legislator who did that would get his vote. Slaves that Washington took north with him when he entered public life, he quietly left behind when he returned to Virginia after completing his term as president, in effect freeing them, quote unquote, on the sly, as one biographer put it, at a time when to free them officially could have set off controversies that neither he nor the new nation needed. George Washington was, after all, trying to hold together a fragile coalition of states, bearing the resemblance to the world power that the United States would become in later centuries. It's really cool that instead of cowing down to what people may think or whatever, he just did it like under the table. He did it anyways because he didn't fear being found out or whatever. But he didn't do it public. You know what I'm saying? He still did it. He wasn't afraid of being caught, I guess. Anyway, as a slave owner in Virginia, like, oh, let's just not do it. Let's just wait until my term is done and then you guys are free, right? Kind of thing. As a slave owner in Virginia, Washington thought of ways he might sublet much of his estate, in which his current slaves, in quotes, might be hired by the year as laborers, end quote, by tenant farmers. He was clearly casting about for some way, as he put it in the letter, end quotes, to liberate a certain species of property which I possess very repugnantly to my own feelings, end quote. But there were no takers. Washington's behavior as a slave owner is also worth noting. Beginning in the early 1770s, he rarely bought a slave, and he would not sell one unless a slave consented, which never happened. Okay, now hang on a minute. You know how we're told that literally like everybody was treated so nasty and stuff? So this guy over here, Mr. President Washington and all of that, would only sell his slaves if the slave was okay with it, which never happened. So they liked their situation there, just saying. Wouldn't you jump at the opportunity to leave if you could? If you didn't like a place? Just saying. Anyway. Okay, let me find my spot. Hang on a second. Found it. Not selling slaves was an economic loss. I bet it was, because when you don't have the product to be moved or whatever, then you need to get rid of the help. Like, for example, you don't keep, if you have landscapers, we do not. If you have landscapers, you don't keep them year round and find something for them to do every day, all day, year round. You just don't do that. You ask them for help when it is that you need the help, right? I'm not going to keep a plumber here on the premises. We're going to do everything that we can DIY ourselves that we're legally able to do. And then if there's something that we cannot do, we will then hire the plumber, right? We don't keep a plumber on retainer or anything like that. So it just does not make any sense to keep slaves around like that. Not selling slaves was an economic loss. Slave labor on a plantation with soil as poor as Mount Vernon brought in little or nothing. The only profit a man in his position would make was by selling slaves to states where agriculture was more flourishing. Washington would not, in quotes, I am principled against selling Negroes as you would do cattle at a market. Okay. This goes against everything that I've been taught about him. Anyway, even though our family was in real estate and sold Mount Vernon to him, just saying. From 1775 until his death, the slave population at Mount Vernon more than doubled. That's incredible. As southern states in the 19th century began to tighten restrictions on the right of slave owners to free their slaves in order to forestall the social problems that were widely feared, the laws made manumission increasingly difficult, legally complicated, and a costly process. Those slave owners who were prepared to grant manumission found it less onerous to let those who were legally their slaves simply live as de facto free persons. In antebellum Savannah, for example, 2 of the churches in the free black community there were headed by ministers who were among the most prosperous members of that community, even though they were legally speaking still slaves. Okay. And they acted like nobody did anything, right? Like, being slaves, you couldn't be prosperous. You had to be under the white man's thumb, under the white man's boot or whatever. And they just, I mean, it's just the way that they portray it in the media. Washington wasn't the only one that treated his slaves well, just saying. And as you're hearing me read right now, people who are still slaves are still some of the most prominent people in their communities outside of the plantation. Okay. Do you hear what I'm saying? Many blacks who had managed to gain freedom for themselves individually, then legally owned members of their own families because it was not financially or otherwise feasible to go through what it would take to free them all de jour. Quakers also held legal titles to many slaves in their southern churches, while it was an open secret that these quote-unquote slaves lived free and independent lives. I mean, there's crickets, right? Like, in the case of John Randolph, John, the charge of hypocrisy is hard to sustain in view of the events surrounding his death. Never married and so without heirs to his estate, he made provision in his will years before his death that his slaves were to be not only freed, but provided with land in a free state on which they might hope to live in peace and be self-supporting. In a will written a dozen years before his death, Randolph wrote, in quotes, "I give and bequeath." So you can't say that the man was senile and he was coerced to do these things, right? You literally can't. 10 years before his death, right? Let's see. It says, 12 years, a dozen. In a will written a dozen years before his death, Randolph wrote, in quotes, "I give and bequeath all my slaves their freedom, heartily regretting that I have ever been the owner of one." End quote. An earlier will said, in quotes, this is an earlier will, so older than 12 years, okay? End quotes, "I give my slaves their freedom to which my conscience tells me they are justly entitled." End quote. That this was said by a conservative white Southerner, a bitter political opponent of the abolitionists, and a man who asserted the right of secession long before the Civil War suggests something of the complexity of the issue, confronting those who faced it directly as a human reality rather than as an abstract question. Knowing the stringency of the laws of the South, when it came to the freeing of slaves, when Randolph felt that he was dying, he summoned a doctor whom he wanted ostensibly for medical treatment, but in fact as a white witness whose testimony would be accepted in a Southern court as to his dying wishes. So he went out of his way to make sure that somebody can say, hey, I bear witness to this. He's in his right frame of mind. He's not being coerced by anybody or anything like that, right? And it would hold up because he wanted to make sure, y'all, like there's 3 different ways it seems here that he wanted to make sure: an earlier will, or will 12 years before, and then when he felt like he was going. He wanted to triple make sure. Anyway, being accepted in a Southern court as to his dying wishes. Once the doctor was present, Randolph ordered his black servant not to let the doctor leave the room until he, Randolph, was dead, so that there would be no legal question about what he had done. This was the scene. Randolph was propped up in the bed with pillows at his back. With his last remaining strength, eyes flashing, he pointed his long, bony index finger at the assembly, in quotes, "I confirm all the directions in my will, respecting my slaves, and direct them to be enforced, particularly in regard to a provision for their support," end quote. Raising his arm as high as he could, he brought it down with his hand open on Johnny's shoulder, end quote, "especially for this man," end quote. He then asked whether each of the witnesses understood him. Immediately, Randolph's keen, penetrating gaze clouded. His mind gave way, and he slumped down. So he absolutely made sure wholeheartedly that the people were going to be taken care of, including the man that was at his side for however long. Randolph's will provided money to purchase land for his freed slaves in a free state in order to give them a chance to be self-supporting as free people. But even in the free state of Ohio, the opposition of local whites made it impossible for them to live on the land he had provided, which is crazy to me. The racial animosity that he had feared from the beginning would blight their chances was rampant, even in the North. Even in the North, y'all. Have you been told about that? Because I surely was not. I always heard it was in the South. Whatever the merits or demerits of Randolph's personal or public policy conclusions, quote-unquote hypocrite hardly seems the right word for him. Abstract moral decisions are much easier to make on paper or in a classroom in later centuries than in the midst of the dilemmas actually faced by those living in very different circumstances, including serious dangers. Exactly. You can say what you would have did however you want to. Like for me, if I was ever a slave owner in a past life or what have you, I would have hoped that I would have been loving and caring. Like as soon as my mind had that switch flipped that these are human beings, what the heck are you doing? Right? I would have been like, oh my God. Oh my God. Okay. So how do we do this? How do we take care of you on the sly so that nobody comes burning my place down? How do we take care of you in public view in front of everybody to when things lighten up so that everybody can know y'all are well cared for? I mean, they would know they were well cared for anyways, but I would be doing it on the sly, right? I would think that I would take care of them regardless. One way, once I came to my senses, one way to understand the constraints, but you never know, right? Once you're faced with it, you never know. I would just hope that I would morally and logically do the right thing. One way to understand the constraints of the times and their effects on public attitudes is to examine the difference between the way that many in 19th century America saw the slave trade, as distinguished from the way that they saw slavery itself. If the institution of slavery and the presence of millions of slaves were facts of life within which many decision makers felt trapped by having inherited the consequences of decisions made by others in generations before them, the continuing trade in slaves, whether from Africa or within the United States, was a contemporary problem that was within their control. Thus, decades before slavery was abolished, the United States joined in the outlawing of the international slave trade. Even many Americans not yet ready to support the abolition of slavery as an institution nevertheless made the bringing of more slaves from Africa a capital offense in the United States. One of the few individuals whose appeal to President Abraham Lincoln for clemency was denied was a ship's captain named Nathaniel Gordon, who was hanged in 1862 after having been caught bringing slaves out of Africa. His ship was bound for Cuba, but was intercepted on the high seas by a warship of the American Navy because of the international ban on slave trade, and even though slavery itself was still perfectly legal at that time in Africa, in Cuba, and in the United States. Clearly, the evil nature of slavery was recognized by the severe penalties imposed in America on those who continued to bring slaves from Africa, though there was not yet a consensus on what to do about the millions of enslaved people already in the country. End quotes. In the North, with all the hesitation in many matters, there existed unanimity in regard to the slave trade, end quote. According to W.B. Du Bois, Gordon's trial and execution were not even controversial and received little attention in the press. Also, I did not know of the U.S.'s hand in trying to stop slaves from being transported and to end slavery in general. I had no idea, right, that it spanned the world. None. Even in the antebellum South, Virginia Congressman John Randolph again exemplified the cross currents of the times in the dichotomy between the way that slave trading was seen and the way that slavery itself was seen. Although a fierce opponent of the abolitionists, Congressman Randolph was nevertheless adamant against slave trading at home or abroad. Despite being a slave owner, Randolph did not engage in the practice of buying or selling slaves himself. And that's another thing too, is people are talking about how people had slaves, but did you find out how they got those slaves? Were they at the auctions getting the slaves? Or was it passed down from generations because they were associated with the land, or they weren't associated with the land, but they were written in the will that they were to be taken care of and passed down from generation and stuff, right? I mean, think about it. So if you want to go after reparations or whatever, right, you have to understand that you're going to get reparations from all nationalities, like because all nationalities owned slaves, and then you're also going to have to go back and see who it was that purchased those slaves and how come it is they kept the slaves that long. Were they legally bound to do it? Was it too expensive for them to free them properly? And so they would free like one of them, and then those people would then take over the ownership of their own family members? I'm just asking. And then do you get reparations for them? I don't know. Done to go hang, we had a good chance to get to, we meet again, love you, mean it.